So let's turn. Then let's have one of these in case somebody wants a portable mic.
Maybe just sit here. Nice to see you. You know, usual first morning of the conference.
Yes.
Craziness. I'm gonna leave this here. So if I apologize if it's in the way. You can.
Hello,
How are you?
could be better.
I'm under caffeinated. That's my only issue right now. This is he's the research network chair for social sciences and research network chair for global studies. And this is Scott, who is our colleague here.
Yes, I think we have.
All the,
You had a Zoom meeting, okay.
your experts.
2 years ago, there was a conference.
There we go,
I'm just gonna go
online.
get all the supplies. I'll be right back. So
Yeah. Yes. Testing. I don't know that this. Oh. Yes. Is it a PDF?
yes.
Okay, hang on. The short answer is yes, but the longer answer is it depends on what we've got on this.
Already asked the nice delegates here to help me because I crashed it earlier.
Should. Hang on, we gotta.
That's what I write. It must be right.
No, it's yeah, it's kind of really young, but. And this, see, this is reader, this is. No, I think we only may have reader on this. Okay. Okay. I am, speaking of caffeination, going to go in caffeination for a half a second. Do I need to pick up a badge from the?
Yeah, Tatiana will have it.
Okay, where is she?
She should be there.
That's.
Yeah. I mean, in theory, she could be. How was your travel?
Oh, fine, just 1 hour on the train.
It was okay.
Not too bad. You came here straight from Krakow or just stop?
We went home to America because you know that's the normal thing to do. Because the kids were there, so we had because we're going to Greece after this, to visit everyone there.
Okay.
So then we had to pick them up.
Okay.
So
How
Sophia's out there.
Okay.
I don't know if you saw her, but
No, I only saw Phil.
yeah, and so we were there for 5 days, and then we came back to London on when was it? Thursday or Friday? And then no, it was Saturday.
You're still affected by jet lag, so
Well, so I didn't even have any notice of it because it didn't, you know.
you weren't there long enough.
Yeah, we weren't there long enough. So
to switch. Right.
download as a JPEG, accept.
Text units. Gorzej, że Junis nie ma.
Oj, ludzie to są kurczę jednak, wiesz, lazy asses. Jest chyba ponad 200 osób. Idę na konferencję osobiście, a na sali 20.
Sorry.
Hello, we have already met in Warsaw.
Meeting you.
Great to
And
see
I know
you.
that you arrived very late last night.
Oh, it was, nearly midnight, so, yeah, but
Yeah.
it wasn't bad, it wasn't bad, yeah.
I am just good. I wanted to climb the second to have to report. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Rafal.
The phone.
Nice to meet you. You are the local host, right? No,
Hello,
Hello, hi.
I'm Marcin.
Oh, hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm from Krakow, co-chair of the Interdisciplinary
Oh,
network.
wonderful. Oh, wow.
Next year, we'll be hosting the
Oh,
conference.
see.
Your position.
Okay.
This is the page, this is the head of the Center for Development. And Pleasure to meet you. I really want to build a connection between what you do with you and her, because they do a lot of work with Unitar.
And also,
The more we can connect.
Okay, I'm gonna do one last round.
Wow. And this is your
interdisciplinary, yeah.
Oh, bravo, it's
That's
fantastic.
the one.
You're really sure about the title.
I totally.
I don't think it's just waiting for.
No, down this is,
Make them speak.
fencing, either one.
A miał coś mówić?
Okay, I think we'll get Scott to start.
That's going to come.
Yeah, I'm good. This is Supriya.
The whole.
Yes.
Yeah, finally.
You can get.
Okay.
And what does your father and your father? Yeah, so the order will be 1, 2, Marcin and sorry, Marcin, then your father. Anyway, you two will go first. Okay. No, I'll be the first.
Yeah, he's the one, yeah.
1, 2. Okay, and then I'll turn it over to my city. Yeah, right there. And we'll go from there. Okay, and then our first. The first. Units, okay, okay. Well, I will tell you right now. Yeah, I don't know what to do. So just pick one. It's okay. One and we'll be.
Don't worry. I already, I'm very grumpy already.
It's on the way. It's on the way. It's on the way. Yeah, that's what they told me.
Already had it.
At your PNV.
Yeah.
We are very.
All right, let's get started.
I don't know.
Morning, everybody. I am not going to use the microphone because I have a very long history of blowing sound systems with this voice. So it is, I had years of theater and choir training, and microphones and I just don't get along. So welcome to the International Interdisciplinary Social Sciences Conference. My name is Scott. I'm the postgraduate program lead for architecture here at Oxford Brookes, which really is just sort of a ridiculously British way of saying that I'm in charge of all of the postgraduates office. And what I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our school, and then I'm going to turn it over to Supriya to talk about a specific aspect of our research. We have 5 research groups inside of the school, one focusing on design theory and practice, one on cultural context, one on low carbon building, one on architectural engineering, and then the Center for Development and Emergency Practice, which Supriya will talk about in a minute. We are an extraordinarily interdisciplinary school and then in a very interdisciplinary university. So I would very much like to thank you all for coming hundreds or thousands of miles to join us here in Oxford for an in-person conference. We did this 2 years ago when the world was shut down and everything was online. So I'm really thrilled to see everybody here. And I really appreciate all of you coming, contributing, and I'm looking very forward to all of the great discussions that we're going to have over the next few days. So I will now turn on the microphone and hand it to Supriya to say a few words because she probably is, it needs the amplification, unlike me.
Yes, I do need. So thank you, Scott. First of all, again, a very warm welcome to all of you from Center for Development and Emergency Practice, short form for CENDEP, which is also part of School of Architecture. But before, I say a few words about CENDEP, I gather that we have participants from 48 countries, and that's such a remarkable achievement, isn't it? In this whole global world, people from 48 countries are over here interacting for the next 2 days and really exchanging this wonderful idea. I think we also have people from Australia, New Zealand, which seems so fantastic, great that you come from all the way. So you probably are one of the furthest participants. So that's amazing. Thank you. And yourself. And then we also have, I think, colleagues from, Latin America. Great. What Asia? Oh, that's great. Wonderful to have you guys. Yeah. So, and Europe, USA. Yay, okay. Africa, anyone? Yay, okay, that's great. Right. Have I left anybody? Anybody spontaneous? Huh? Oh, stand it up. Stand up, yeah. Thank you. That's great. Anybody else second on the count?
The British.
The
It's a separate continent. No others.
Well, I just hope that, you all wonderful people from these different parts of the world are able to connect with each other and we really, I think together they're able to really set out some of the things, but also address some of the major challenges of our times. As the conference title goes, agency in the times of displacement and social change. I spoke about CENDEP. One of the essential research themes in CENDEP is on forced migrations, inclusive recoveries. And one of the areas that we look at is, what are the reasons for this displacement? And we find that there are at least two threads, at least at CENDEP that we engage with. One is the conflict, and the second is the climate change, the disasters. Both of which are leading to, local sort of, vulnerabilities of people, livelihoods lost, and due to which people are, are forced to migrate. And we all know that urbanization is also an increase. And so one of the threads that we look in CENDEP is, how do we support the resilience of these people who are on home? What kind of policies, whether from the governments or from the organizations that we work with, can enable them to build their resilience? And one of the central things that we find through our research is that we need to ask right sort of research questions. So I'm really hoping that this gathering will be able to sort of raise very critical research questions and also share with each other with the different research methodologies that we use, so that we really are able to gather and capture the voices and the narratives of the people who are on move, who are displaced. And again, when we talk about, I spoke about one of the themes, which is of CENDEP, which is on inclusive recoveries. And therefore, for us, we also look at people, and also people who come from specific social context. They may be women, they may be indigenous people, they may be people with disabilities, they may be farmers, they may be people with doing very different kinds of livelihoods, but all facing the common challenge of vulnerabilities which have arisen from maybe disasters, climate change or conflicts. So I'm really hoping that we are able to sort of cross-fertilize ideas, and very central to CENDEP is also the idea of co-creation of knowledge. We do believe that in order to address some of the challenges, we need to work together as researchers, as policymakers. And the more we are able to sort of work together, the more we are able to develop research which really speaks to the needs of the people about whom we are, we're talking about, people on move, displaced people, and find solutions which are able to address their core vulnerabilities. Before I end, I do want to let you know that we do have 2 master's courses. One is an online master's, which is called Masters in Conflict and Peace Building. And the second master's is something that we run over here in Brooks. It is face-to-face. It is called Masters in Development and Emergency Practice. And we do address some of the core things that this conference will be speaking about in our master's course. I hope some of you will be, inspired by Oxford and also our work, and spread the word around about our postgraduate courses, and either come join us, or let your colleagues and the students know about us, and I really hope we have a wonderful time together. So a very warm welcome again from Sender and School of Architecture and University, and I'll now hand over to
Awesome.
Good morning to everybody. My name is Marcin Dalen. I'm a co-chair of the Interdisciplinary Social Sciences Research Network. I'm from the Jagiellonian University in Kraków, in Poland. This is important information because I'm also a co-host of the next year's conference, which will take place in Kraków, in Poland, at the Jagiellonian University. And I will also remind that we've got 2 networks here. I'm a co-chair of the Interdisciplinary Social Sciences, and the second one is Global Studies Research Network. It is a pleasure, it is an honor and privilege to be here and welcome everybody after this first not fully achieved group to organize a conference in Oxford Brookes University. It is fantastic, a tremendous opportunity to be here, to see all the faces from all over the world. It is fantastic to welcome all the delegates who are not with us, but who are scattered around the world, probably watching our lecture and opening ceremony via their devices. I will say a few words about one thing, which is very special this year. It is Rafał Mazanek Award. It is named after a colleague and friend, academic, who was deeply engaged in developing global studies and interdisciplinarity in social sciences. He sadly passed away 2 years ago, very prematurely, and his wife decided to found an award which consists of 3 financial prizes, each of 500 pounds. The award committee will be trying to find these papers which are closest to the spirit, academic interest, and way of thinking of our late colleague and friend. And the 3 awards will be announced during the final ceremony on Friday. The details will be given also later. I think this is the most important thing for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcin, and good morning, everyone. I'm Rafał Sobolski, and I represent the global studies stream of the conference. Having said that, we work very closely together, and I hope this synergy will bring about a lot of interdisciplinarity and mutual learning during the conference. I'd like to very briefly just focus on the theme of the conference. It's now a commonplace, unfortunately, that we live in an era of crises and displacement, but we also want to question human agency in those turbulent times. Agency, of course, is a key concept both in social theory and in social life, and I think it's really been brought into focus by development in technology. Think of artificial intelligence and the extent to which it perhaps prevents us from being able to be fully in charge and control of our social life. The question is to what extent these new technologies that we created have come to control us. Agency also features in political debates, where populism increasingly questions the role of political institutions. It's also important to consider it in economic life, where trends of automation and casualization again perhaps question our agency. So we hope that this very broad theme will focus the attention of many of the papers. We certainly have great plenary sessions that approach it from various perspectives, and having looked at the abstracts, I can see that the papers will also work extremely well to shed light on this topic. We are often reminded that globalization does not mean the end of history, that is not necessarily progressive, and we also have one panel tomorrow, plenary panel, that I would like to advise about globalization of the far right, perhaps localization of the far right, as we're going to argue. We see that just as progressive forces try to organize internationally more or less successfully, we see the same process on the far right edge of the political spectrum. So I look forward to fruitful debates, to interdisciplinary exchanges, in the usual spirit of mutual support and mutual learning. And as Martin mentioned, I hope that the experience this year will make you attend our joint conference in Krakow, which will focus on the question of migration in a global age. So an extremely pressing and topical issue. So I hope you enjoy this conference, and I also hope to see you in Krakow in Poland next year. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Oh, that's really quiet. You're all ready to go. Well, I've got a plan to close. I'm the Chief Social Scientist of Congo County. I'd like to welcome you all here to challenge to be out in the world again, and we really appreciate the effort that you have all made to be here today. I'd like to thank our host, Scott and Supriya. This has been nearly 3 years in the making, COVID in between, but I appreciate the way that they have led us intellectually, found great speakers, found a theme. It's been a wonderful and productive conversation that we hope continues for some time. I'd like to thank our 2 research network chairs. We put global studies and social sciences together a few years ago. One, because there's so much overlap in the work that people do, we thought it'd be a wonderful opportunity. Also, we have 2 colleagues that work together, and so this is an exciting experiment of communities that are independent and join, kind of things that we need to do in this world today. I want to talk just a little bit about some of the things that make this conference work, what we're trying to do, and some of the things that make you understand a little better how to navigate the next few days and next few years. Firstly, one of the things that we did when COVID hit was really think about what the Solely conference is. It's a kind of temple box. It's 2-3 days. We get inspired, and we then go off into our own worlds, and that inspiration and energy sometimes dissipates. And so we thought, we also didn't want to build a temporary shelter. You know, we all saw our restaurants and cafes and whatever they did, they, you know, took over the curb and built a, you know, wooden artifice that was always meant to be removed. It was not thinking of about public space or what is the future of eating or things like that. And so what we did is that we built this event software, this microsite which all of the content lives in. And we did it because we want to build an archive, collectively build an archive, which you as members of this research network can return to and have access to. So when you, while we have a printed program, one, it's an environmental disaster, that printed program, so that's one reason why we don't do it, but also because we want to push you into this space. So you'll see there's a tab on the far right, which is our online, far right, not that far right, which is where our online delegates are. And it's asynchronous. Why do we choose asynchronous? Because time zones are a kind of exclusionary boundary, where things happen. And so we didn't want to reproduce that. And so they've uploaded videos, PowerPoints, which you can view and engage with the discussion board. But you too also have that presentation page and you can add your content as well. And so whatever you think is a good way to express the work that you're doing, we encourage you to do it. And if there's content that you don't see that you want, we have a little button where you can request it. And that person will see that request and hopefully upload that content too. And then what that means is that in a year, in 2 years, you can sign back in, you can go to that page, you can view the work, and then that way the conference doesn't end to a certain degree. It's always accessible. It's content that we give back to you, and that's a really important part of what the transformation that we wanted to consider is. The other thing is that we didn't want conferences just to be in rooms anymore, is that we wanted you to have research experiences that were outside of this conference space, different kinds of conversations. And so we have a case study here, which is at the, it's on Friday, which you're all, it's part of the program, it's not an extra, which is to the Pitt Rivers Museum. Information is in the program and we'll all go together there. And again, we want to have these productive spaces that you can present your work, but also find other ways for you to connect. The other thing that we do, which we want to continue to do, this is not something new, is reward emerging scholars. So we have a great emerging scholar program which you can apply to. I say every year, emerging is an existential concept, it's got nothing to do with age. And we have a wonderful group of emerging scholars, if you're laughing at me at the back now. So could you stand it up, this year's awardees? Like, don't give them a round of applause. I don't know the symbolism of the glass wall back there, but they will be in the room with you chairing the session. Again, it's important for us to get emerging voices at the front of the room, guiding conversation, being as visible as possible. And so we really want to thank them for being here. The other thing that's important to us is to be bilingual. And so you'll see that we have presentations in English language and Spanish language. There are 20 language delegates. Hello. Hola. And so I will introduce up onto the stage our Spanish language scientific director, Jose Luis. It wasn't trained technology for 20 years, and I always switch his names. It is like some disease that I have.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for again, these few words in Spanish. Is dedicated we have in now section in Spanish. Bueno, pues lo primero que quisiera que dar la gracias como ya sobre todo tenemos inglés de manera abogada, por si acaso. Las gracias a Words por la presentación, también a la colega Sofía Gerka, y luego los presidentes de las dos redes, de los dos congresos que tenemos estos días aquí, Marcin Gantz y Rafael Zubowski, buenos colegas y amigos ya de otras conferencias. Philip Karazutov es el Philip Topkas.
Oh, yeah.
Philip Karazutov es el gerente que lleva todo el tema de la comunidad.
y desde 2017 tenemos esta sesión en español, que la hicimos por un poco, porque yo veía en todos los congresos, llevo trabajando desde 2005 con ellos, que no había una representación grande, no había una soltura para hacer un debate, en muchos casos la gente no presentaba porque no se veía con la confianza, y eso fue En 2024 tendremos este mismo congreso, los dos congresos en Cracovia, como decía antes los dos presidentes de la red, ahí ya presentaron y invitaron, ¿no? Se ha dado la gracia a los medios scholars, a los becarios, ayudantes, asistentes, y esta necesaria en este funcionamiento, y comentaron, bueno, que el tema ya lo sabéis, también en el programa, que sería la gente en una era de desplazamiento y cambio social. En cuanto a las cifras, tenemos 212 registrados en la parte de inglés, 130 aquí en persona, y en la parte de español tenemos 144 registrados, ahí está muy bien, y de ellos 50 que están ahí registrados para estar aquí en persona ahora. Y como última cosa, I think that we should say this in both languages also. We have all the panel sessions are recorded on next to the registration desk, except for room 4 today. Okay, it's in the building in front. Nancy coffee breaks are all in the room next door. We have coffee this morning, and it's a good registration equipment. Please try to use your USB. And the extras, we have a conference dinner tomorrow, and there are some last spots left, so then you want to release yourself for dinner tomorrow, that would be great. And the reception is going to be on Friday, where the lunches and coffees take place again. Vale, algunas cosas, las sesiones paralelas van a ser todas en este pasillo, que ahí es donde tenemos el registro. Toda la comida, todos los papeles y tal, los incluidos, lo tenemos también en esta sala, donde será la recepción el próximo día. Además de eso, tenemos el case study, tenemos el case study, el caso práctico, digamos, el viernes por la mañana, que es muy interesante. La verdad que es algo que hemos incluido en los congresos últimamente, para que haya un evento práctico de allá donde vamos, que podamos ver cómo se está trabajando el tema de ese congreso. En este caso será en el Fifth Rivers Museum, será el 21 de julio, y bueno, principalmente, pues saber que durará aproximadamente unas 2 horas, habrá que estar aquí a las 9:40, cualquier información al respecto para poder consultar con nosotros, y bueno, pues, también. Muchos de ustedes also, you guys and team, Tatiana, Tamsin, all people that are there and helping their backstage, also giving a hand to organize this one. Vale, pues felicitar y darle gracias también a Tatiana, Tamsin, a todo el equipo que está detrás de la organización. Y nada más, bienvenidos, welcome, y vamos.
Perfect time. Time. Exactly.
Very good.
Like in German. Could be.
Yeah, so hello again. Great pleasure now to present our first plenary, Professor Yunus Gorge, Professor of Politics at American University, London, UK. Her talk is titled Voice, and More Voice, Building Countervailing Power in the Age of the COVID Crisis. Just very briefly, Professor Gorge is, as I said, Professor of Politics at Richmond University. Her area of expertise is ideologies and the role of ideas in the activities of political parties. She's particularly interested in understanding how ideas rise and fall out of fashion. A theme she explored in her doctoral thesis, the Labour Party and the idea of work, which she successfully defended at the LSE in 2002. Her last book was The Labour Party under Ed Miliband, Trying but Failing to Renew Social Democracy. The book explored how the Labour Party adopted and adapted old and new ideas for its 2015 electoral manifesto. In 2022, she won the Michael Friedman Prize for the best article published in the Journal of Political Ideologies. Ideas and party change, redistribution and socialist renewal in the Labour Party under Ed Miliband. She has continued to research and publish on the ideas of the Labour Party, and she's currently working on a short introduction to European social democracy, which will be published in 2024 by Agenda Public. Once again, Professor Eunice Goresh, voice to voice and more voice building countervailing power in the age of the polling. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for the very generous invitation to address you this morning. I was a little bit nervous because, as Rafael explained, my field of expertise is slightly different from the fields around global studies and the field that covers all the social movements. So you'll see that I have actually quite a lot to learn from you. But first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, which was a great honor to be addressing you this morning and to open the conference of the Global Studies Research Network. As Rafael said, I am a political scientist who has written in research the area of how ideas influence politics, how those ideas can also affect change. I've also conducted some research in the past about deliberative democracy. So I hope that what I have to say to you today is relevant to the field of global studies and social movements. And I also hope that it addresses the topic of the conference on agency in an era of change and displacement. So as the prompt of the conference suggests, we are living through a moment of great turbulence and potential transformation. The world we inhabit is in a state of flux. It is difficult to make sense of the world, what is happening around us, and even harder to glimpse what lies ahead of us. Some social scientists define such moments as critical junctures. And a critical juncture is that fork in the road moment that is pregnant with possibilities which can lead to transformative change. However, it often results in stasis. In fact, the last 15 years are illustrative of the combination of the potential for transformational change and stasis. As historian Adam Tooze noted, and he's essentially the author of the idea of polycrisis, we are living this polycrisis, which according to him, we are experiencing big, turbulent, painful crises that have appended the terms of political debate about how the world functions and how it should be organized. Crucially, the cumulative effect of these multiple and simultaneous crises is a general sense of disorientation, but also a sense of powerlessness. I think it is worth listing the many multiple crises that have created so much disruption in our world in the last 2 decades. So we had the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, which reverberated across the world. We live in a refugee crisis, which has been ongoing since at least 2015. We're experiencing multiple manifestations of a climate emergency around the world, an emergency which poses an existential threat to all forms of life in our planet. We've also been witnessing the rise of political polarization, manifested in the rise to power of strong men who show little respect for the rule of law and democracy. We've lived through a pandemic that shut down the entire planet and which created the worst global economic crisis of the last 100 years, according to the World Bank. Since last year, we've been experiencing a new world war in Europe, which has global ramifications. And we continue to see the uneven distribution of global power resulting in the continued exploitation of the global north by the global south, which is often manifest in war, in violence, in famines, and local displacement. And to make matters worse, the way that all these crises interact with each other have intensified them and have prolonged them too. Historical institutionalists say that successive external shocks like the ones we are experiencing and I've just described, they open the moment for very short periods of time, they open the moment for a window of opportunity. And that window of opportunity is for transformative change. And this is so because at times of uncertainty, there are times where the old certainties about how the world works have guided actions. The guided action, they are frictions of ideas. And so policymakers in those conditions are normally more open to new ideas, to make sense of what is happening, to reorder the world and find solutions to old and new problems. In fact, right on cue, the French president Emmanuel Macron, when he was confronted with the pandemic, he noted that we are faced with a very profound anthropological, political, and geopolitical opportunity. So, crisis or crisis, open windows of opportunities for transformative change. But as historical institutionalists and other theorists of change have noted, transformative change does not solely depend on the perfect alignment between a crisis and a perfect idea. Indeed, hundreds of windows of opportunities have been missed by progressive forces. And they were missed not because those progressive forces were wrong, but because they were powerless. In 2008, the death of neoliberalism was announced by hundreds of oracles. And at the time, it looked counterintuitive, almost irrational that neoliberalism would survive what looked like a fatal crisis of capitalism. And yet, neoliberalism not only survived, but it has metamorphosed into new climate variants. So, how do we get out of this quandary? Historical institutionalists argue that for that transformative change to happen, all the conditions need to connect. So all the conditions other than the existence of ideas. Peter Hall has proposed 3 criteria to test the power of ideas in processes of what he calls urban change, and which we can call this paradigmatic change. First, he says that plausible and persuasive ideas that offer an alternative to the status quo, they need to be available. And this does not mean that those alternatives must be good and effective. Indeed, often terrible ideas, or what Mark Twain calls zombie ideas, they win, and we all pay the price for the adoption and success of those terrible ideas. So the persuasiveness of ideas is only highly dependent on their intellectual coherence or of their technical viability. So in order to be persuasive, they need to be comprehensible, according to Hall. They need to resonate with the way that the recipients of the idea and policymakers do it, they understand the world. But thirdly, ideas can influence policy. An idea must come to the attention to those who make policy, generally with a favorable endorsement from the relevant authorities. Crucially, the endorsement of a new idea can potentially result in its adoption will depend, as Hall explained, and I quote, not only on the arguments of competing factions, but on their positional advantages within a broader institutional framework, on the ancillary resources they can command in the relevant conflicts, and all the exogenous factors affecting the power of one set of actors to impose its paradigm over others. So because it brings into equation considerations about power, this third criteria is perhaps the most important one. Indeed, this third criteria explains why bad ideas are often the most, on a regular basis, adopted by policymakers. They are adopted because cunning policy and ideas entrepreneurs have grabbed the moment decisively and convince, confuse, and undecided policymakers to follow a particular course of action. There is, of course, an element of luck in that process, but most of it is a question of agency and power. So change happens because policymakers are making choices, but these choices are often the real reflections of society's unequal distribution of power. So to be influential and transformative, ideas need to be sponsored by powerful actors. So that guides us into the way in which citizens and social movements can be able to exercise their agency in an effective way. And I think that the key condition for the exercise of citizens' agency in this world in flux is a solid understanding of power and how power is understood and exercised. Above all, it is important to understand that power is unevenly distributed in the world, including in democracy. And why is that the case? In the 1960s, Robert Dahl and Charles Lindblom theorized about the pro-business bias of the democracies. They argued that business interests had a disproportionate influence in policy making because they had the power to decide whether an economy was growing, whether employment was up or down, and so on. With that influence, those corporate interests gained even more power. Legislation covering everything from employment rights, to data protection, to climate change, has been done and is increasingly done by those corporate influence. And as I have in fact explained, there are two phases of power theory. With an equal distribution of power in our society that awards corporate interests so much influence is reproduced to the agenda setting process at EU level. But this unequal distribution of power is not destiny. This unequal distribution of power can be challenged. The power of capital is dominant. After all, businesses have captured policy making in all democratic and non-democratic regimes of the world. But capital is not a divine force. Citizens and social movements have the capacity to mobilize what the economist J.K. Galbraith defined as accountability power and effect transformative change. We've seen this happen countless of times. In the early 19th century, the labor movement campaigned for universal rights, for universal suffrage, and the extension of new economic and social rights. We saw also the force of that motivating power again in the 20th century, when anti-imperialist and independentist movements expelled European colonial powers from African, Asian, and Latin American countries. In Latin America, was slightly early in the 19th century. And also in the 20th century, when we saw trade unions leading the call for workers' rights and for the development of welfare states. We saw it again with the powerless campaign for democracy in Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia in the 1970s, and the 1980s, and in the 1980s. We saw again the force of that motivating power of organized workers and social movements, when multinationals had to lobby governments and international organizations to weaken the power of trade unions and block any attempts to give genuine power to workers in the workplace. And I think in the last 2 decades, we saw how the climate movement forced global elites to start addressing the climate emergency before it is too late. So in each instance, the motivating power of organized citizens and social movements transformed societies for the better. So to win this power struggle, and it is a power struggle, citizens and social movements must deploy their most powerful weapon. As Albert Schman argued, voice is political action for excellence. But to be effective, social movements and citizens need to contend with the implications of society's unequal distribution of power and calibrate their voice for greater effect. As Peter Hall argued, the power of citizens' voices is dependent on the ancillary resources they can command in this particular settings. So, after all, citizens also did not rely on the support of powerful actors who can sponsor their agendas and their ideas. For that reason, they need to deploy all the tools that make the best use of their capacities and position in the hierarchy of power. So the voice has to be calibrated to different expressions and manifestations. And as Hirschman put it, voice is a far more best concept because it can be graduated all the way from faint grounding to violent protest. It implies articulation of one's political opinion rather than a private secret vote in the anonymity of a supermarket. And finally, it is direct and straightforward rather than roundabout and vote. So voice can be angry, voice can inspire, and voice can also be extremely powerful. And voice also requires quite a lot of courage. So to be powerful, voice should be deployed in a variety of ways. Most of them, those ways are familiar to the scholars and activists of social movements, but also in other ways which lead to the greater organization, but also institutionalization of civil society into a greater dialogue with established political institutions. So the point that I'm making here is that the projection of voice can also serve a variety of goals. And in the rest of my talk, I will concentrate on 2 goals in which the voice of civil society can achieve. One of them is the agenda setting which involves widening of terms of political debate by inserting new issues, new topics on the political agenda. And the second role is about actively participating in decision making. So as you know much better than me, there are many organic and creative ways of developing that cultivating power, which has the capacity to widen issues. There are many wonderful and successful examples of this type of voice, but today I want to talk to you about the inspiring work of the Argentinian artist Tomás Araceno, which I saw recently in London, and which I think represents a very powerful way of exercising agency through voice in a way that is congenial with the culture and the practices of social movements. As Monique Duveau pointed out, democratic activity is also reflected in the acts of cultural dissent, subversion, and reinvention in a range of social settings. So this is an image of one of Tomás Araceno's work, which is his Webs of Lives, which is part of the project Arachnophilia. Now, Saraceno has shown through his art how citizens of social movements can find and exercise their agency in a way that transforms society. In fact, his work, which is built from wide and diverse collaborations with artists, philosophers, scientists, activists, teachers, gives agency not only to people. He also believes that art and the natural world can have active agency. So Saraceno's visions of new forms of life in common are markedly idealistic in their erasure of territorial boundaries and social exclusions. He presents his prototypes as a new form of liberation, explaining that so far we have seen freedom of movement and capital amongst the people. So, for example, in this work he has hybrid scenes of spiders showing that they are created through the social power of those networks. In the various iterations of his Arachnophilia, a hybrid webs project, he has mixed spiders from different parts of the world, and together they collaborate and weave these very large, intricate, unique, and beautiful webs. These are very fragile structures, and in fact, showing this fragility is a key component of Saraceno's art. But I think there are more powerful messages in this work. Firstly, the collaboration prompts a reflection about our coexistence with the natural world. Secondly, the web weaving by a hybrid and transnational team of spiders is a key component in the maintenance and protection of balanced ecosystems. So these are all images from these different Arachnophilia projects, which are, I think, quite an inspiring way of promoting that a greater coexistence with all different species of our planet. He has another project which is called the Aeroscene, which he proposes as an alternative to the Anthropocene. And this project, the Aeroscene, also carries important aspects of today's social movements and crucially shows that the politics of possibilities is viable. As Joanna Page explained, by promoting free access to the atmosphere, the Aeroscene imagines space as a commons and becomes a physical and imaginative place clear from corporate control and government surveillance. For example, in his Flying with Pasha project launched in 2020, which is on specific the images in these two pictures, it involved the documentation of the first flight of an aerosol balloon over the vast flats of Salinas Grandes in Argentina. This was the first ever fossil fuel-free human flight without burners, solar panels, batteries, helium, or hydrogen. The project involved as well the lobbying of the Federal Aviation Administration to define a category 4 solar flights, present for the recognition of aerosolar technology as a viable new form of mobility. So by seeking this recognition and legitimation, Saraceno is reclaiming the airspace from corporate interests and enacting the paradigm shift that is needed to take us into this new era of decarbonization. But a second and very powerful component of this Aeroscene project involved a campaign against the exploitation of lithium in the lands of Argentina, Peru, Chile, and Bolivia, which is an exploitation which threatens the livelihoods of communities in this part of the world, and which is a key component of Europe's green transition. So this component of the Aerosol project happened earlier this year in Alfacito, in the Argentinian province of Jujuy, in collaboration with the communities of Salinas Grandes and the Laguna de Guayacayo Basin, together with scientists, lawyers, philosophers, sociologists, and climate activists. This gathering attracted the attention of the world media, which reported about it, but culminated in the declaration that the area of Salinas Grandes in the Laguna or Guayaquil Basin is a subject of rights. This declaration, which is supported by international treaties and conventions, aspires to become a new legal framework that enables ecosystems and non-human species to have the same protection and rights as people and corporations. So with this project, Saraceno's work suggests a different way of doing politics, one that is not so much shaped by the languages and divisions of traditional ideologies, but one, to use the words of the French philosopher Bruno Latour, with whom Saraceno has collaborated, is one form of politics that proposes a politics that moves individuals into active engagement and dialogue, not driven by ideology, but by interactive action and participation in itself, and which includes, crucially, non-human agents. So Saraceno's work is just one example that illustrates the agency and capacity of citizens and social movements to widen the terms of the debate about climate change, to agenda set, and crucially to enable citizens to exercise their agency. But there are other ways to enable citizens to influence global decision-making and to participate directly in that decision-making. And funnily enough, I think that the Saraceno's work in Alfacito suggests how that can be made. And so I'm now going to talk on how the voices of civil society can involve a form of institutionalization, for want of a better term. So this form of voice that I'm talking here is one that involves some form of institutionalization, but crucially does not imply the co-optation by powerful institutions, though it is often seen in that way by social movements and by the scholars of the public sphere and democracy. So the institutionalization of civil society does not preclude its spontaneous activities. Indeed, these spontaneous reactions, and in particular the angry reactions of citizens and civil society, are essential for democracy. But there is only so much that these acts can achieve. The most influential thinker of the public sphere, Jürgen Habermas, was acutely aware of the limits of the voice of the global civil society expressed in the public sphere. He argued that discourses do not govern, because the capacity of the public sphere to solve problems on its own is limited. According to Habermas, the public sphere can influence political decision-making, but not in a direct way. In the Habermasian formulation, the opinions of civil society must be given a shape in the forms of decisions by democratically constituted decision-making bodies. He contends that the flow of communication between public opinion formation, institutionalized elections, and legislative decisions is meant to guarantee that influence and communicative power are transformed to legislation into administrative power. So in the end, Habermas ascribes a very limited role to what he calls the public sphere. To him, its role is to work as a warning system with sensors, but it cannot be conceived as an institution, and least of all, not an organization. He argues that the voice of civil society expressed in the public sphere does not aspire to the responsibility of taking political decisions. According to Habermas, and I quote, the communicative structures of the public sphere relieves the public of the burden of decision-making. The postponed decisions are reserved for the institutionalized political process. In other words, he claims that civil society does not aspire to have a greater role in democratic decision-making. He also suggests that there is a division of labor between the spontaneous civil society and formal political institutions. Jean Brizek agrees with Habermas He argues that this division of the labor between civil society on one hand and the state on the other does not consign the former to the powerless realm. He claims, in fact, that a number of transmission mechanisms are available and enable public to be translated into administrative power. Similarly, Amy Buckman and Alice Thompson argue that civil society must remain substantially unstructured to allow for free will donation. Habermas has raised two other pertinent objections to the institutionalization of the voice of civil society in our public sphere. His opposition was grounded in two main fears. First, he felt that the public sphere was not as legitimate as democratically elected institutions. And second, he feared that the public sphere would merge with the state. He defined this phenomenon as the statification of society with the neo-corporatist superficialization of the state. Regarding his first fear, Habermas argued that though ideally civil society in the public sphere should influence the process of political decision-making, he suggested that political decisions should be taken by parliaments, by courts, and democratically elected institutions. This justification is this argument is somewhat justified and it's pertinent. After all, the spontaneous deliberations of civil society are not necessarily democratic. It is often difficult to establish whether the deliberations of civil society are truly representative of the public they are supposed to represent. However, this shortcoming can be addressed by democratization, democratizing civil society, and this can only be done within institutions. Habermas' second fear was also about the threat of fusion between civil society expressing the public sphere and state. He feared that institutionalization of the public sphere, for want of a better term, would ultimately result in its absorption or co-optation by the state. And his fear was based in the fact that in these circumstances, the public sphere would lose the ability to counter and challenge the state. But examples from democratic federation involving a wide range of citizens show that does not need to be the case, because in fact, in many instances, the institutionalization of voices of society resulted not in co-optation, but in participation in decision-making. So I'm not convinced by Habermas' objections. It is also not clear that some institutionalization of civil society is a constraint to free will formation or will always result in co-optation. So it can result in some co-optation if that the institutional design is not correct, but in most cases it doesn't. Indeed, it will require this institutionalization, it will require the setting up of certain rules of engagement, but only those that enforce equality and reciprocity. And it also involves bargaining, negotiation with powerful groups. But that is essentially the nature of politics. All types of politics involve collaboration, bargaining, and negotiation. For these reasons, I am not sure that either Habermas, Reisegg, Dublin, and Thompson are right. On the other hand, the division of labor that they propose between the voices of civil society and representative institutions, this division of labor reinforces society's unequal distribution of power and condemns civil societies to a subaltern role. So one way to ensure that the voice of global civil society influences change is to give it more power. And one way of doing it is through institutions. So to argue for the formalization of the voices of civil society is about ensuring that the voices are heard, that they influence decision-making, and that they are involved in enacting change. And the reality is that the unstructured deliberations and expressions of civil society do not guarantee that its voice will be heard in the process of political decision-making. Indeed, often the voice of the public sphere is sidelined by political decision-makers. At best, political representatives cherry-pick the popular issues and causes that they want to champion. Moreover, the spontaneous public sphere does not guarantee that participation will be sufficiently inclusive. As Habermas himself admitted, the public sphere tends to privilege the dominant, the better organized, and the well-resourced groups in society. And we see that when the very well-organized and well-funded organized social movements of the global north dominate discussions on development, climate justice, and so on over those of the social movements of the global south. And so that is why the voice of civil society needs that proper institutional setting. Its formalization in the liberty institution has the potential to facilitate open and inclusive public discussions and to enable the development of common and democratic positions on issues that then can be proposed by democratic and representative institutions. This will not result in a dramatic change, but it will help to weaken the voices of the powerful. I think the most powerful argument for the formalization of the public sphere was perhaps made by Nancy Fraser. She argues that any conception of civil society that requires a sharp separation between association of civil society and the state condemns the public sphere to the realm of being significant. According to Fraser, this separation reflects a limited conception of democracy because, and I quote, it is unable to imagine the forms of self-management, inter-public coordination, and political accountability that are essential to a democratic and egalitarian society. What is needed, she argues, is a post-bourgeois conception that can permit us to envision a greater role for at least some public spheres than mere autonomous opinion formation, removed from authoritative decision-making. So the creation of an institution or institutions that represent the voices of civil society would bring three main benefits. First, it would dilute the influence of powerful actors, thereby evening out access to public deliberation, opinion information, and decision-making to all participants. This can be achieved by the imposition of formal rules of engagement that insist on the primacy of equality and reciprocity. Operating under such rules, the discursive outcomes of civil society would bring greater visibility to minority views and to less powerful actors. Secondly, this deliberative institution would prioritize or agenda-setting issues and themes to be later considered by representative bodies. A priori, in such a democratic setting, no topic or issue would be off limits. Everything would be open for discussion. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the creation of this deliberative forum would render more difficult the process of dismissing the voices of civil society. Within a proper institutional setting, local, regional, national, or transnational forum, the deliberations of the public sphere cannot be easily dismissed because they carry no legitimacy. So if these conditions can be met, then civil society can play a role in political decision-making. This institutionalization of voice of civil society can be done in a variety of ways, and all of them include dialogue and negotiation with other social, political, and economic forces, and which ultimately result in binding decisions. As you know, deliberative democracy is a form of decision-making that is open to all citizens, but which is predicated on the idea of deliberation before voting. Its purpose is to promote an inclusive, egalitarian, and rational form of decision-making, and can operate under many formats, including citizen assemblies, mini publics, participatory budgeting, or any other form of meaningful citizen involvement in policy-making. These forms of deliberative democracy, which are not panaceas, they are not the miracle that will solve all those problems. These deliberative forums are very quietly disrupting the power monopolies of professional politicians, traditional political parties, national bureaucracies, and corporate lobbies. And we see that from the participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre in Brazil, to the citizens' assemblies in Ireland, from the Panchayat reforms in the Indian state of Kerala, to the Global Citizens' Assembly at the 2021 COP Summit, we've seen diverse groups of citizens have been changing the global conversation about poverty, inequality, gender, climate justice, and democracy. But more than changing the conversation, these new democratic structures offer genuine power for ordinary citizens. And this is because these forms of deliberative democracy go beyond consultation processes. The results of the citizens' assemblies in Ireland, of the participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, and of the Panchayat reforms in Kerala have resulted in binding decisions that have transformed society. These binding decisions were possible because this new forum had created an institutional relationship between civil society organized in deliberative forums and the institutions of representative democracy. So these models of government work very well at the local level, but I think they can be adopted and adapted at the international level. In fact, organizations like the European Union and the UN have already the practice, as well as the institutional setup, to listen to organized interests on a regular basis to decide their agenda. But I think that this practice should go beyond participation. These transnational bodies should create institutional mechanisms whereby the voices of whole civil society, as well as those of national parliaments, regional assemblies, local councils, are able to inform their own deliberations and decision making. So this is what I call the institutionalization of voice. And this is a form of institutionalizing the voice of civil society, which can contribute for the projection of an effective and powerful voice that can lead to transformative change. So I'm going to conclude by going back to Hirschman. He said that voice is all that members of human societies have to work with, which affect change. But his word should not be taken as an admission of weakness, because voice is not the only power that citizens possess. Voice in itself is power. Throughout history, the organized voices of social movements and human communities have been powerful agents of change. There is no reason why this shouldn't continue to be the case, but this time powered by institutions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, for this excellent talk. I share your concerns, and I have to say I fully agree with your assessment. I didn't realize how close we were intellectually and in terms of our, how we think about these movements. I'll open the room to questions in a second, but first I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair and ask the first question. And the question is concerned with technology. Going back to those movements that were not so successful in challenging neoliberalism post 2008 kinds of movements like Occupy, others, and then on the side of social theorists like Manuel Castells, for instance, fetishizing technology, fetishizing networks as allegedly creating conditions for this absolute horizontality and giving this absolute authentic voice to social movements. And in my view, it hasn't really worked that well, right? To some extent, these movements focused more on how they were saying things rather than what they were actually wanting to say or what they wanted to achieve. What's your view on the role of technology communication? How can social movements use them to prevent being sort of hijacked by this technology?
Yes, that's a really important question. So I think my first and kind of immediate response is that revolutions are done by people, not by machines, not by telephones or Xerox machines. So this being said, technology is a great help. And we've seen how, for instance, the movement for democracy was greatly helped by the spread of literacy, and that was essentially the printing press that also allowed for the spread of literacy. So, and circulation of mass circulation pamphlets, newspapers, and so on. But this requires actually groups of individuals who are brave and courageous and who are ready to sometimes risk their lives to challenge the status quo. With social media can help to organize movements and activities transnationally. So it can be a great tool for organization, for recruitment, for mobilization of certain issues. One interesting aspect of that kind of mobilization was actually brought about by research by Alan Margetts, who showed that this is during the Arab Spring, the use of technology enabled the emergence of a different type of activist. The kind of activist was normally absent from social movements. He brought from our women to those movements, whereas of course social movements were very much male dominated. So it is, I think, technology is can be a fantastic tool. But the key ingredient for social change is human action, is human, it's the courage of human beings to challenge established policy.
Thank you.
Okay, any questions? I bring the microphone to you. Or-
I think I probably could have shouted across the room as well. Thank you for that very, very interesting talk. I got a lot of very valuable notes. I just want to follow up actually with the first question. Do you think that the technology makes it easier for these social movements to be infiltrated or hijacked by those who would try to counter what the movement was trying to do?
Yes, I think so. I remember reading about the Arab Spring and how at some stage the activists were resorting back to paper in order not to be caught by the authorities. So there is a very big risk, and now with the happening of networks, sites, and so on, it means that information is readily available, and of course, authorities, the police, the repressive apparatus of the state has very sophisticated tools essentially to monitor the activities of the citizens. We've seen that already. Well, we've seen this in the democracy like Britain during the coronation and the recent coronation of the king, where Republican activists were actually caught and they were arrested even before they had even put on a placard outside because they had received information from somewhere. They were probably hacking people's phones, hacking their WhatsApp messages and so on, to essentially know where they were going to be and essentially stop any kind of activity. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you very much. It was a very inspiring talk, and I really want to be convinced in a way. But I must say that I have a problem with that because the concept of civil society that you use and we often use in our research assumes that civil society is a good thing in the sense that it's a community of people who share belief in equality, pluralism, and so on and so forth. So, but the problem is, and I'm saying that as a person who has studied anti-gender movements in the last couple of years, that it's a very optimistic view, I would say. And there is a more talk now about liberal civil society or, well, different types of civil society. And I'm saying civil society both in terms of a grassroots engagement and also in terms of organizational forms, but also a self-identity of the activists, right? So my question is how to fit that into your analysis, because I think that making this assumption that civil society is always good and always shares a set of values which are good for democracy, basically, however we will define that, leads us astray. And I'm saying that recognizing that, for example, in Poland, where I come from, many of those organizations are go-go's or are sort of elite established organizations, but many of those are actually grassroots organizations. And they sometimes have quite fashion views. So what about that?
Thank you. That's a really very good question. I won't have kind of a ready-made answer to that. It is absolutely important, and you are absolutely right, that there are a lot of very liberal voices in civil society. But I would say that democratic deliberation, and in particular the process of democratic deliberation, would be a way of, well, they have to be included in the conversation because hiding them and pretending that they do not exist, I don't think solves any problems. The assumptions of deliberation is that free, but also moderated conversations, essentially not allowing certain groups to dominate conversations. The assumptions of that deliberation is that you're going to have a transformation of practices. that people can change their minds while they are listening to rival voices. And what we have that component of the civil society, the liberal voices that actually dominate our public sphere at the moment. I don't think it's on the whole, I think it is very, very, very widespread. Well, behind them, there are also extremely powerful, extremely well-resourced lobbies who are funding the activities of those groups. And what we create is not really a conversation, it's not really a deliberation, it's a kind of shouting match. It's essentially calling and addressing and targeting people's worst instincts and worst fears, as opposed to having a conversation. And so the discussions, the deliberations I would propose are not those that are being conducted at this moment in TV studios, which essentially the way that the media operates is about having fights and people essentially who can shout loudest wins the debate. But the principles of democratic deliberation are actually about bringing together in the room not people that share the same viewpoints, the same worldviews, but who come from very diverse backgrounds. And while they are listening, while they are hearing and being exposed to other experiences, other voices, they may change their minds. Maybe this is a kind of an optimistic view, but this is essentially I believe in that the promise that the democracy, especially when tackling these very divided issues, tackling those areas of public life where people have such extreme views and so such opposite views. This is where the potential for the mainstreaming of public opinion can be achieved. And I think there's been some research done by social psychologists that show that if you put in a room people, a very diverse range of people, the result of that discussion is going to be a mainstreaming towards the center. Whereas if you put in a room people who have just opposing views, what happens is a kind of the reinforcement of that polarization. So hopefully, if there is an investment in this kind of political forum, maybe those very angry and liberal voices can be transformed, not silenced, but transformed. Thank you. I hope I answered your question.
I hope you're right.
I hope you.
You have a question, yeah.
First of all, thank you for your conference. It's been very inspiring. My name is Gabriel. I am a postdoc fellow on international studies, and my focus of research is on global governance. So I was thinking during the presentation that if we put this into a broader scale, considering we are passing by a moment where the institutions are somehow under check in terms of performance and also in terms of credibility, I share with you the view that institutional ways is a path in order to achieve advances. But how do you see nowadays, in terms of these credibility and performance challenge, that the role of institutions can be understood nowadays?
Thank you for that question. I think there is the ideas around liberty and democracy have never been as current as now. There's lots and lots and lots of experiments around the world using different models. And I think there is the moment, there's a kind of that window of opportunity, the moment has come for that form of decision making, precisely because the typical classical institutions of representative democracy are under strain. We see, our parliaments essentially becoming powerless institutions in the hands of very powerful executives. We see the politicization of the judiciary in many countries. We see also corporate media and the mainstream media gain an incredible power over decision making. So there is space, and I think there is an openness at the moment to try to experiment with different forms of institutional decision making. And I remember reading many years ago when I was in my PhD, the cosmopolitan democracy model of David Hell and Daniele Akibuji. And I think at the time that model was very much dismissed as, this is kind of utopia. But I think that we are not far. When you look at the way that the European Union is operating and is already developing those dialogues with civil society, this can be pushed further. And it can be done in a serious way. There are, of course, serious obstacles because how do you engage millions of citizens that represent a whole continent or the whole world? It is difficult. The questions and problems of representation, problems of scale exist. But I don't think that they are unsurmountable. So at the moment, I am bringing on to the idea that there is openness to reform democracy, to accept that representative democracy has serious limitations, and the way to address these limitations is actually to open space for the voices of citizens to come forward and to bypass political parties, or to become another voice besides political parties, which organized unions and so on. So widen the space for political decision making.
One more question.
Hello, my name is Deidre Neal, and my research is around psychobiological and psychohistorical development in leaders. So my question to you is around sustainability, right, of these ideas and these voices of social change that we see. They do make progress in that, but to me, it's the sustainability of those changes when you have institutions that are heavily tied to these historical tropes and traditions. So I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts were about that.
Yes, well, it's a very difficult question. It is how I think that they have to be open, and there has to be pressure for that change. I do not believe that that institutions are unreformable and that traditional forms of life are they are permanent, they stay there forever. I come from Portugal. 50 years ago, my country was in dictatorship. Women could not open bank accounts. There was no right to divorce and so on. There were very few women at university. And Portugal is not a paradise by any stretch of the imagination. But the country has changed tremendously, and the institutions have changed tremendously. It's still extremely conservative. The most inefficient bureaucracy with cultural traits still of the former regime. So that culture is the thing that takes the longer to change. That happens. Change happens. So if there is pressure from civil society, and if civil society can also persuade and engage in that campaign all the more institutional and powerful voices, because you need those sponsors. Having those powerful sponsors helps. This is a further addition to that campaign, kind of opening up the political institutions that have been so resistant to change.
We have space for one more question, but we will have to be quick. There are quite a few. I don't know who's first. Okay.
Thank you for your lecture. I teach at the University of Waterloo, so my question is at a different scale. How do you teach in a classroom where you have a young man who just came in 3 weeks ago or so into the classroom on campus and took out 2 knives and attacked the professor and 2 students? This was in a class of philosophy of gender. So how do you allow for voice in a classroom where the stakes are very high and people's personal safety is at stake? I have a gay friend who taught engineers how to communicate. You can all laugh about that. But she taught these young men, and they are Trump supporters, and 3 of them in a row gave presentations about the myth of the gender gap. How do you deal with that at the level of the classroom?
Well, it's quite the horrible, quite a horrible experience. I had one experience, not of an attack, but actually of a student carrying a knife this big, not only in classroom, but trying to get to Parliament with a knife this big in her bag. Well, I think it is again, the institutions that I was talking about are those institutions that have, they are important because they have rules of engagement. And so one of the very key rules of engagement in a democratic political forum is, of course, respect. And of course, non-violence, and respect means non-violence. So, why would that person carry knives? It is extraordinary. I don't think there's also an institution solution for somebody to break the laws. This is a far more ambitious project that requires the whole engagement of society, of other political institutions that actually persuade young men not to carry knives and attack their instructors, because they do not feel that they are being unfair and let down by the world as it is. I'm so sorry for giving such an imperfect answer.
So we will manage this final question. I hope disappointed.
I hope it's gonna be the final question. And thank you for bringing that Waterloo situation. I teach at the Housing University in Halifax, and we were shocked. I was thinking about locking my doors when I went to class to teach, but I don't know if that's gonna work or not. I just want to go back to the idea of crisis and how crisis opens, you mentioned transformative change, right? I'm a little bit very skeptic about this notion of crisis, because crisis can be either natural or man-made, right? And the transformative change that crisis brings is also can be positive or negative, and tying into the idea of the powerful people, so the less powerful are going to really be the ones who are victims of this. And I've seen that what happened during the Katrina in the States, when George Bush said, crisis is the best, it's the time for us to actually look at ideas that were not, that were refused in the past. And New Orleans is completely different than the poor folks really lost. So I just want to bring this up and say, crisis could be good, but crisis can also be bad, and crisis can be man-made, not natural. And we have this issue going all over the world where we have with the oil crisis. There is oil, but the producers don't want to pump out oil. So what do? We pay more money, right? We get egg. There is food. In Canada, we had this issue where there's issues with the transportation, with food distribution, and the prices of food went up. And the causes crisis, so the price went up. People are complain. We had the issue with bread in Canada recently too, where the bread companies conspired and created a crisis just to up the price, right? So crisis can be, if it's natural crisis, yes, but what we have to worry about is this man-made crisis just for the purpose of gains, and that's one of the things that we're doing.
Well, all the crises, as you said, all the crises that we've experienced are all man-made. So they can be unmade. So essentially, there's the whole question of the agency is there. The problem, and I think this is what I was trying to say with bringing people forward. They open up windows of opportunity to change, but more often than not, that window of opportunity closes and change did not happen. So essentially, we have the reinforcement of the forces, the traditions, the policies that were already there. So more often than not, crises end up in being missed opportunities to change. So the point, how can then citizens, social movements, civil society can actually act as a countervailing power to those existing powers that benefit from the status quo? The point is about organizing, it's about organizing voice in a way that voice can be heard and affect change. That's essentially what I tried to say with my talk. Citizens have a great ability to change. I think the humanity's history of the last 200 years, and I think even before, but this would have been periods of immense social transformations. And that has happened because of human beings who are, and often the powerless who are exercising their agency. It requires a lot of courage, it requires a lot of patience, but I think it requires a kind of a determination and not giving up, and believing that we can't do anything about it, because that's exactly what they want us to believe, that we cannot do anything about it. This is the way that the world is.
Thank you very much. We have to. There will be time during lunch to ask more questions. Thank you very much. We have this gesture of appreciation to you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, I just want to prepare you for a fictional crisis that's going to happen at 10:40. And that fictional crisis is a fire alarm. So 10:40, we will be filled with dread and panic, but there is no fire. So, we'll let you know. I apologize in advance. And we don't have to leave.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you. I was quite.
Yeah, but all these questions about this, paradigms.
Yeah.
And
Yes, there is.
public
Yeah,
speaking.
I know. The assumption that the global civil society is always good. Yeah.
All these billionaires who are manipulating the alt-right.
But the outright, there's, I don't know if you read the book of Peter Gagan about something against democracy.
So,
He has mapped.
welcome to our second plenary session. I'm going to introduce your time course with maybe a little bit of a less biographical, more personal introduction, because I've known Jorn for about 20-ish years at this point. We met through a mutual friend, Dr. Joseph Uhas, who may or may not be either a space alien or a wandering trickster god, who's slumming it here on Earth. But Jorn is an associate professor at the University of Colorado in Denver, which is, full disclosure, my alma mater as well. And he works in the landscape architecture department, but has wandered around it with many duties, including chair of the architecture department for a period of time. And does a lot of collaborative work with groups such as the UN. We do, full disclosure, we do research together. Potentially at some point, there may be a book that's co-authored, etc. But he works a lot with issues around crisis, landscape, rights, authenticity, identity, and a number of other things. And also has wandered the earth, living in many different places, attending university, I believe in Edinburgh, teaching down the hill at Oxford Uni. There's somebody here who he taught at Oregon. So an incredibly well-traveled and very well-rounded individual. So I give you Jorn, and let's get started.
Great, thank you so much, Scott. I hope you're all well caffeinated because I will take some excursions into theory lands, and I think that my talk serendipitously will tie in very well with what you talked about, Eunice. So I'll try to explore and critique the role of space, place, and landscape on the one hand side, and relate to that the role of language in developing and maintaining agency, emphasizing in particular the agency of people who generally don't a lot, the marginalized, deprived, discriminated, displaced, etc. So again, full disclosure, I'm by training a landscape architect and planner. I also spent a little bit of time in medical school. But my work and research have strayed quite a bit outside of most of the mainstreams in those fields. What I'll talk about is, as Scott hinted to, mostly rooted in my work on disaster response and recovery, or crisis response, and in response to what we were talking about, crises kill people, right? So just to be very clear, crises kill people. So in short, I'll try to propose a superficially simple framework to pursue the theme of this conference. Fundamentally, there is no human existence without location where this existence takes place. Human beings have to occupy physical space to actually exist. The ability to be in and act in place is very much the central dimension of agency. The notion of agency, of humans' ability to exercise their will to make decisions and act accordingly, and to have experienced and formed insights that hopefully inform such decisions, has of course been debated. However, the role of space, place, and landscape in this has been often and outside a few fields and disciplines dismissed or largely ignored. I will be relying fairly heavily on writers and thinkers who are critical of Western traditional, territorial, capital, and colonial formations of landscape, and the attendant dichotomic categorical distinctions trying to relate and bring together perspectives from Latina, Indigenous, Atlantic, African, and Afro-Caribbean studies, as well as queer theory. My talk attempts to develop a theory of what I call landscape citizenships and the expression of the right to place based on the assumption that it is impossible to separate landscape from the people who inhabit it. They'll weave together.
Ignore the alarm.
Okay, I'll try to talk over the alarm. Can you still hear me without getting ahead? Thank you, alarm. So, it weaves together a range of critical perspectives that have been largely absent from most discourses. I'll look at physical space, place, and landscape, and in particular, the expressions of borders, boundaries, on edges as central locations of landscape citizenship. I'll look at marginality and liminality as critical processes in establishing landscape citizenships, and consider the uncanny as a dimension of encountering the other, the strange, and strangers. Far from looking at border boundaries and edges as static constructs, I propose overlapping, fuzzy, and nested boundaries that insist upon an openness to the other. The aim is to establish a foundation to discuss and enact the rights to play and landscape citizenship as a foundational concept to frame and enact what some authors call landscape democracy. Landscape democracy is rooted in, quote, a mutual understanding that landscape is essential component to ensure everyone's well-being and indisputable universal human rights. Promoting and materializing landscape democracy then is a critical step for spatial justice and enacting the right to place. All the more pressing in times that Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid times, times of environmental, political, and general uncertainties. The identities of place and people are mutually constitutive, entangled, and have developed over time. Life worlds and life ways intersect and entangle in place and time. Home and homeland, property, territory, garden and wilderness, culture and nature are potent cultural constructs and material realities that are immensely consequential. Livelihoods depend on them, and wars have been fought over them. There's a need to expand and reframe the prevalent Western discourses in space and identity, on place and belonging, on landscape and citizenship, as most of these are rooted in colonial perspectives and based in understanding landscape as physical and bounded terrain upon which the nation state is constructed by colonial action, or as a country being constituted with its people and established for actions over time. These discourses are intertwined and rely on physical and social conditions as relatively stable and depend on the drawing of boundaries and central and constitutive actions. Here, us, them, cis-trans, and maybe most importantly, self-other are some of the criteria and conditions that are used to delineate and distinguish. Implicit in these is the question of who we are in the context of the places and landscapes we inhabit and call ours. Landscape citizenships then are shaped by two entangled dimensions: the landscape belonging to its people and its people belonging to the landscape. All kinds of claims and rights, but also responsibilities derived from these fundamental constructions of belonging to and being in space. Cosgrove's contention that landscape constitutes a discourse in which identifiable social groups historically have framed themselves and their relation with both the land and with other human groups, and that this discourse is closely related aesthetically and technically to ways of seeing, suggests the reciprocal formation of human identity and landscapes as central element in establishing the sense and fact of belonging. This framing and formation of collective and individual self and landscape then becomes spatialized, rendered visible, and put into effect by the drawing or making of boundaries, borders, edges, and thresholds, categorical, conceptual, and physical. While geophysical, ecological, and dimensional boundaries precede human existence in the landscape, in fact, many definitions and delineation of landscape are based on these, for example, watersheds, mountain ranges, etc. They are traits given meaning and assigned value and consequence by humans. This tracing is made all the more problematic by the nature of set boundaries. They are de facto zones of transitions, ecozones, characterized by gradual changes over both space and time. Other borders are pre-conceived by the human minds and projected onto a location, often immaterial, but nonetheless consequential, and sometimes made manifest by physically changing a place, by something as subtle as time or as incisive as a wall. International borders and property lines being some of the most significant examples. Set boundaries are mostly considered static and persistent, and are instruments to separate something and somewhere from something in someplace else. In the context of a rapidly changing world, these notions need to be challenged. The philosopher Edward Casey, in his investigation of La Frontera, the border between the United States and Mexico, interprets boundaries not just as instruments and conditions of separation, but as something that connects, articulates, frames, and enables complex relationships over time and space. He sees the world as being made up of many different types of edges, of limit-trophic phenomena that can be interacted with and inhabited in various ways. The histories of colonialism and imperialism reveal another, much darker dimension of the relationship between bounded territories and the people who inhabit them. The drawing and enforcing of boundaries onto a place of people by acts of overt or covert violence. The term belonging here then takes on a very different connotation, one of forceful subjugation by a colonizer and equally forced acculturation into the colonizing cultural system. This almost by default creates multiple contested identities and multiple contested belongings, as the territory might be most representing the indigenous or colonial system of power and signification. Chicano, Latino, Latina hybridity have been widely discussed and serve as a good example of the simultaneity of multiple identities in lifeways which may be held within one body. The writings of Gloria Anzaldúa describe such contested identities and show the difficulties and ambiguities in attempting to describe Chicano identities along the US-Mexico border. Los Chicanos straddle the borderlands. On one side of us, we're constantly exposed to the Spanish of the Mexicans. On the other side, we hear the Anglos incessant clamoring so that we forget our language. This voluntary yet forced alienation makes for psychological conflicts, the kind of dual identity. We don't identify with the Anglo-American cultural values, and we don't totally identify with the Mexican cultural values. We are a synergy of two cultures with various degrees, Mexicanness or Anglo-ness. I have so internalized the borderland conflict that sometimes I feel like one cancels out the other, and we're zero, nothing, no one. Anzaldúa clearly articulates hybridity and exists of multiple simultaneous landscape citizenships in the same location. The landscape citizenships are not merely realms of identity and pre-established modes of belonging, but realms of praxis, of the practices of everyday life evolving within place life forms. The making of borders and boundaries by and large has failed to create clear, unambiguous, stable, and uncontested cultural collective and individual identities based on the physical, political, territorial ordering of place. The landscape one dwells. The clear and stable distinction between us, them, here, there, cis, trans, and self-other, so often encoded in statements on citizenship, appears to be as much desired by some as remaining ultimately elusive. Onibaba offers another critical perspective on the colonial and post-colonial articulations of difference that underpins the formation of cultural identity in place from the perspective of minorities. It is in the emergence of the interspecies, the overlap and displacement of domains of difference, that the intersubjective and collective experience of nationness, community interest, or cultural values are negotiated. How are the subjects formed in between or in excess of the sum of the parts of difference, usually intoned as race, class, gender, etc.? How do strategies of representation or empowerment come to be formulated in the competing claims of communities where, despite their histories of deprivation and discrimination, these meaningful values, needs, and priorities may not always be collaborative and dialogical, but may be, in fact, profoundly antagonistic, conflictual, and even incommensurable. What causes the first place between the stereotypical differences of colonial discourse and foregrounds hybridity as a positive condition that causes new forms of life and culture to come into existence? He argues that cultural identities cannot be ascribed to pre-given scripted cultural traits that define the conventions of ethnicity or territoriality, which are often conflicted in colonial discourse. Colonizer and colonized cannot be viewed as separate entities. Baba suggests instead that cultural identity, the social articulation of difference from the minority perspective, is a complex, ongoing negotiation that seeks to authorize cultural hybridities, involving an ongoing exchange of cultural performances that in turn produce a mutual and mutable recognition or representation of such cultural difference. In his words, this negotiation creates then a liminal space that is a hybrid site that witnesses the production rather than just a reflection of cultural meaning. Very much emphasized the role of boundaries when he states that it is in this sense that the boundary becomes the place from which something begins. This concept of liminality not only pertains to the space between culture and collectives and identities, but between historic periods, between different languages, and systems of signification, describing liminal space as in between the designations of identity that becomes the process of interaction, the connective tissue that constructs the difference. towards concept of the sandwich. Green masses grow togetherness, and Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau's animalistic pluralism all attempt to subvert the ordering of difference. And I'm explicitly concerned with the making and unmaking of boundaries at other edges, emphasizing the processual over the final and determinate. Edges, borders, boundaries are then considered not just delineations and delimitations of physical and non-physical things and spaces, but as the very processes and expressions of emergence, becoming and change that connect space with human action and thought. Such delineations and delimitations are not a stated material, nor are they static. Edges are fluid, vibrant in Jane Bannon's words, and the way and locus in which humans make sense of the world and of themselves in that world. Edges, borders, and boundaries, whether immaterial or physically manifest in place, are some of the most important instruments of the spatial production and reproduction of power and hegemonic order. And also, conversely, the very locations and tools of resistance against such order. Edges are sites of negotiation, of construction, counter-construction, highly contested, seemingly separating, but in fact connected. While the drawing of boundaries and edges within Renaissance, colonial, and capitalist thought has been about clarity, visibility, legibility, and stability, their actuality is rather different. Edges can be ambiguously ambivalent, porous, and enabling. Edges are location of what Baba calls the liminal negotiation of cultural identity across difference of race, class, gender, and cultural traditions. This third space, where hybridity takes place, becomes manifest as negotiated, continuously produced at reference. Edges are, in short, where the other is encountered. Response and is responded to, they are where an ongoing dialogue between what's on either side of that edge occurs, and they are where a third space is created or is emerging, subverting colonial notions of center and periphery. More so, edges, and in particular the subtype of border, might be more influential in the formation of identity than the center of a territory. They are the place where hybrids and in-betweens emerge, but also where entrenchment and the sharpening of identity occurs. In short, there is much more about connection than there about separation, and more about destabilization and change than stability and order. Baba calls communism and instability as positive aspects of hybridity, as the processes and conditions that generate new forms of life, in particular when seen from the perspective of the minority or the marginal. The view of and from the majority, the center or the hegemonic, yield a different perspective. Borders, boundaries, edges, and thresholds, as much as they're needed to provide order, are neither stable and predictable, nor, despite appearances, clearly delineated conditions. They are complex borderlands full of slippages and gaps. The qualities of many of such edges and thresholds, borders, and boundaries present in landscape are locations of what Anthony Vidler and others explore as the uncanny or the unholy, as places where the other, the strange, and the stranger, seen as unknown, dangerous, and threatening, make their presence known. The very edge that is seen as a source of safety, order, and control, as in the edge of clearing, the wall of a room, or the fortification walls of the city, becomes an opening, establishing connection to the very thing it aims to keep away. What is inside forms the center, what is outside the margin, the periphery, is terra incognita. Ipsum dragonis, here the dragons, is not just a face on medieval maps that delineate the unknown. The unknown may appear within and across the boundaries and edges created by humans and infiltrate the familiar and homely. Reappropriated, uncanny to speak of the return of the migrants, the minorities, and the diasporic, proposing the city, the space in which emergent identifications and new social movements of the people are played out. What he calls the perplexity of living might be in these terms interpreted as the theory of edges and the uncanny that destabilizes traditional notions of contemporary, the spatial forms and the national, the capital, and help to comprehend how the boundary that secures the limits of the Western nation may imperceptibly turn into a contentious internal liminality that provides the place from which to speak both of and as the minority, the exilic, the marginal, and the emergent. The question then is, how does one belong in and to a landscape in place in a rapidly changing, liquid, interconnected, globalized world whose inherent uncertainty creates so many an atmosphere of ambient fear? Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman describes the dominant sentiment is the feeling of uncertainty about the future shape of the world, about the right way of living in it, and about the criteria by which to judge the rights and wrongs of one's way of living. Uncertainty is not exactly a newcomer in the modern world of this past. What is new, however, is that it's no longer seen as a mere temporary nuisance, which, with new effort, may be either mitigated or completely overcome. The postmodern world is bracing itself for life under a condition of uncertainty, which is permanent and irreducible. This concept of liquid modernity describes the failure of the modernist project of increased human emancipation and describes our current liquid society as characterized by instability and ambiguity and by the erosion or altogether disappearance of what appear to be stable or solid categories of identity and governance. This liquidity affects the very concept and practice of territoriality and belonging. Rapid change is such that social patterns and institutions no longer have time to respond and provide solid and meaningful basis of human identity and collective action. As Manuel Castell suggested, the flows of power generate the power flows, whose material really imposes itself as a cultural phenomenon that cannot be controlled or predicted. People live in places, power rules through flows. Bauman sharpens this point by stating that power rules because it flows, because it is able, beware, ever forgetting it, to flow and to flow away. Landscape citizenship then demand that power must be returned to its foundation in substantive places and landscapes, and that political is practiced in places, counteracting the capacity of power to disengage from place and people and generate fear and uncertainty. Liquid fear analyzes the nature of the fear such endemic uncertainty generates and the consequences of our ability to engage in meaningful social action. To produce a vital feature, liquid fear is without obvious source, derivative, and based on an internalization of a vision of the world that includes insecurity and vulnerability. Even in the absence of a genuine threat, derivative fear will create a reaction similar to the experience of real danger and will attain the self-propelling capacity of the race. This pervasive but detached fear is then used by states, state actors, and others to ensure compliance and social passivity from its citizenry, as the state is not able to deliver on its promise to protect people. The social stability on which state actors' claims rely have been worn away by the uncertainties of global and globalized capitalism, and the inherent inequities of the system have generated a review of physical threats to personal safety, for example, in the form of so-called terrorist violence. The fear of death is arguably one of the most potent threats any system of power can deploy. Until Mbembe stands necropolitics, the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and some must die, into a hegemonic right to impose social or civil death, the right to enslave others, and other forms of political violence. Necropolitics analyzes how contemporary forms of subjugation of life to the power of death and different forms of necropower over the body, for example, racialized state of exception, urgency, martyrdom, etc., reduce people to precarious conditions of life. Mbembe speaks of the creation of death worlds, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead. Referencing necropower's absolute ability to disable by terror, negating any ability for political action, and altogether eliminating any chance for any form of agency. A prevalent contemporary response to liquid fear is the withdrawal into a particular kind of essentialism, a nationalist, latently xenophobic, ethnocentric, and isolationist identity politics that reinterprets and reifies the body politic by hardening and fortifying existing and creating new boundaries and borders. These responses can be seen as ultimately futile attempts to keep the processes of change that affect the world away from particular places and landscapes. Often, such forces and processes of localized and global change become visible through migration and migrants, personifications of the other, the stranger, and the uncanny or unknown. The change that is occurring within a place or landscape is equally seen as a threat, responded to by a nostalgic reinterpretation and recreation of regionalist architectural forms, material patterns, often in conjunction with anti-modern sentiments that mirror the xenophobic and nationalist retrenchments. Allen suggests that the age of anthropophagic assimilation and anthropogenic exclusion strategies is over. Any successful attempt to cope with the unknown, the uncertain, and the confusing needs to focus not on how to get rid of the strangers and strange, but how to live with them, daily and permanently. Partisan prejudice is a very common response in times of fear and uncertainty. Conversely, so are the attempts to transgress, to blur, to penetrate. Conflicting processes that only increase the impact and the intensity of borders. Power's contentious internal liminality that may enable the rights to landscape and right to place as a foundation for a critical, engaged, and inclusive landscape citizenship beyond contemporary neoliberal rhetorics of new territoriality, globalization, sustainability, and resilience. The foundation for contemporary and power inclusive landscape citizenship will have to focus on how edges and boundaries can be occupied and inhabited in new, creative, positive, and imaginative ways. Instead of being seen as a no man's land of separation, no-go zones, and places to be avoided. Any rights to landscape and right to place, according to Lefebvre's right to the city, includes two fundamental dimensions. The right to access to be in that place, and the right to participation, which is a lot less obvious and a lot more complex. Lefebvre's city and landscape can be seen as locations where hegemonic power meets transgressive incursion, where displacement and marginalization take place quite literally, where migration and hybridity occur, a battleground for the fight for the right to landscape and place and identity, the very location where space and identities are ultimately produced and replicated. So who then gets to participate in the production of space and ultimately of self, and how? Michel Desserteau discerns spatial strategies and tactics. Strategies are only available to subjects of will and power, so defined because of their access to a spatial or institutional location that allows them to objectify the rest of the social environment and actualize a schematic and stratified ordering of social reality. Spatial tactics, conversely, are employed by those who lack the space of their own, from which to apply strategies and continuously transgress, re-signify, and disrupt the schematic ordering of reality produced through strategic practices of the powerful. This ongoing conflict and contestation of the social order created through multiple strategies and challenged by multiple tactics can then be a weakest expression of Bauer's contested internal liminality. A right to landscape as a basic human right and foundation for landscape citizenship would then engage the potentials of communities to empower themselves to participate in the discourses and decisions on their futures and the places and landscapes they inhabit. By helping them to expose the underlying mechanisms of their marginalization, propose alternative future scenarios, and first and foremost, to politicize their long tradition of systemic and systematic disempowerment and disenfranchisement. Marginalized and traumatized communities and people would have to become co-authors of the landscape they inhabit instead of being cast or self-identified as merely victims of external and hegemonic agendas. This directly counteracts on the operation of tremendous macro power, which seeks to completely disable the agency of communities, people by uprooting them from a place, deracination, and disempowering them so totally that landscape citizenships are utterly impossible. The geographer Maria Kaida, in the context of empowering communities to imagine new and alternative forms of future human-environment relationships that transcend the boundaries of their life, suggests that we shift from the building of consensus to the monitoring of distances. In other words, to establish diverse discourses and discover new contentious liminalities, focusing on where, how, why, and by whom conflict and disagreement are generated. This is about nothing less than landscape democracy and ultimately about democracy itself, with both the right and obligation to participate in the making of landscape and place, society and culture, and articulate the meaning of the relationship between landscape, democracy, space, and justice. It is important in this context to think of landscape not just as physical entities, but as social, political, and legal phenomena that are the historic expressions of their shared politics and their representative and governing institutions and economies, as well as of the oppressions, forms of exploitation, exclusions, and violence that such institutions and economies license. Democracy is often cast in the Western tradition of liberal democracy, a position that could be considered essentially colonial. There are part of emerging critiques, such as Sulis argue that landscape democracy is necessarily concomitant with the call to healing democracy from its Western association and enable bottom-up culture and place-specific discourse, in order to move towards spatial, social, and environmental justice and to meaningfully and justly enact the discourses located in Balas, Federation, and third states. Meaningful and impactful participation relies on the ability to imagine and enact alternative future human-environment relationships, and includes narratives and knowledge habitually excluded and suppressed as non-experts. Baba most totally conceptualized and proposed a right to narrative as a key element of individual and collective rights to identity, and by extension the right to place and landscape. These rights establish different practices of belonging and form inextricable elements of landscape citizenships. Language then is a key element of the right to narrative, being able to develop and disseminate their narratives in their own language is crucial for a community, group, or individual. At the same time, to be effective and assertive, it needs to be a language that is understood by institutions of power. This frequently creates tensions and has forced marginalized communities in particular into a choice between being authentic or being excluded and ignored. Bakhtin's theories of dialogism and heteroglossia, theories that are highly relevant to how discourses on landscape citizenships, democracy, and belonging are played out, and to the aforementioned non-consensus-driven political theories establish thrown togetherness and in particular agonism. Dialogism recognizes the multiplicity of perspectives and voices. Heteroglossia describes the coexistence of a variety within single language and a reflection of varying ways of evaluating, conceptualizing, and experiencing the world in language. For specific points of view on the world, forms of conceptualizing the world in words, specific world views, each characterized by its own objects, meanings, and values. Dialogism involves a constant engagement with and being informed by other words and people. The distribution of incompatible ideas and elements with the different perspectives of equal value. Bakhtin very much critiques the view that disagreements means at least one of the positions where people must be wrong. As multiple equal points of view exist, singular meanings are replaced by a vast multitude of contested meanings requiring the coexistence of many incommensurable voices. The world is fundamentally irreducible to unity, but not entirely immune to universally shared human experiences and values, such as pleasure, the avoidance of pain, or cardinal virtues. For Bakhtin, dialogism characterizes the entire social world. Authentic human life is open-ended dialogue. The world thus merges into an open-ended, multi-voiced, dialogical whole. Its separation as in Marxist alienation or splitting as in Lacanian master signification is overcome through awareness of its dialogical character, in effect as one big borderland. This is the world of many worlds, all equally capable of expressing themselves and conceptualizing reality. This relies heavily on this understanding. It provides a way to think about democracy that is different from the traditional liberal conception of democracy as a negotiation among interests that aim the democratic society is the creation of a consensus. However, while we desire an end to conflict, if we want people to be free, we must always allow for the possibility that conflict may appear and to provide an arena where differences can be confronted. The democratic process should supply that arena, right? Chantal moved at an estimate cloud. Agonism and agonistic pluralism endeavor to confirm the perpetuity of the contest. Their goal is not to celebrate a world without points of stabilization. It is to affirm the reality of perpetual contest even within an ordered setting and to identify the affirmative dimension of contestation. The polyvocal perspective of dialogism then are opposed by monologism, the exclusive assertion of non-debatable meanings and the refusal of dialogue and creativity. Bakhtin does not view language as a closed system and criticizes the creation of a unified language, monoglossy, as a vehicle of centralized and hegemonic power that suppresses the heteroglossy of multiple everyday speech types. Such closed and monoglossic language, frequently associated with nationalism, attempts to solidify stable relationships between words and meanings and attempts to suppress a free and open dialogue. Bakhtin did not believe that monoglossic dominance could last for long, as it would be challenged by a return of heteroglossic dialogues, much as the Soto's spatial strategies counter and encounter the spatial tactics. The Soto's practice of everyday life, as well as Baba's internal liminalities and perplexities of living, are then aspects of expressions of heteroglossic and open-ended dialogue that is central to the making of spaces and identities, and ultimately of agency. Bakhtin's conceptualization of language here centers the role of language in creating identities of people and landscape, foregrounding its role in the making and unmaking, production and reproduction of meaning, and how we see the world and ourselves in it. This is the very heart of landscape citizenships. Language mediates the different possibilities and forms for relationships between people and the landscape they inhabit. Bakhtin suggests that language use is mediated by societal ways of seeing that are always contested in dialogue and changing. Consequently, landscape itself then, as a heteroglossic conversation, seems to provide a critical and productive perspective. And empowering, and as such should be at the front and center of creating meaningful construction of citizenship and democracy. A quick sidebar here. The very disciplinary and arguably monoglossic languages that are used by many geographers, architects, planners, historians, sociologists, ethnographers, anthropologists, etc., is closely related to different suites of methods or ways of thinking that frequently emphasize Western perspective. There's a canon of writers and thinkers, Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy establishing the Black alternatives to the Western canon, Sonia Sullivan Hope and the counter theories, Linda Tui White Smith decolonizing methods, all of them owning a lot to Frantz Fanon's writing, who critique proposed the monoglossic traditions of Western research and knowledge production amount to what Lacan calls the master signifier, the construct of meaning that only references itself and is removed from any discourse. Ultimately, they disempower and objectify people by telling stories about them in a different language that is overtly or covertly imposed on them, which is the form of necropolitics. So, in lieu of a conclusion, a number of statements and questions. Fundamentally, all this, of course, is a question of how we respond to and engage with what and who is or becomes different. Of course, our differences are perceived, constructed, engaged, refined, and conceptualized, and need ultimately negotiated or suppressed, or how they become an integral part of any lived experience is the cultural process, and one that is in itself contested. Living in and with difference is hard. It's full of inevitable and unavoidable conflict, and requires that one, in the words of Donna Haraway, stays with the trouble. There's a need for processes that go beyond the manufacturing of consensus that liberal democracy emphasizes. I mentioned, for example, pluralistic antagonism or the concept of situated sandwiches. All of these take continuous hard work and embracing the heteroglossic nature. In short, they require to live with and live in continuous conflict and solidify some of that liquid modernity. We are living in the Anthropocene, at least according to some. And so far, this disposition has had a very anthropocentric focus, aside from the fact that that's unavoidable, just to make things a little bit more complicated. There's not just human-human conflict and contestation, but that the humans and other than human species and systems, other than human, sometimes nature, make space, place, and landscape just as much as human do. So those species and systems are assertive too. One could argue that they too actually have a form of agency. So there's a need to engage not just with the other among humans, but also with the other in other than human. While the first as shown is difficult, the second might be harder yet. I will once again leave us here with Donna Haraway's idea of making kin, of encountering, accepting, and engaging with what or who is different. Her notion of making kin is very much about finding and exercising agency, inseparable of forming one's own identity. Agency depends on identity. Identity depends on space, place, and landscape, or being there. And all these are dimensions of existence. So we'll have to stay with the trouble. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your talk was certainly a tour de force of postmodernism's greatest hits. And I'd like to thank you for defending me at the end. I was like, I just wonder though, if your approach, you're not voiced by your own guitar. Okay, in that this primacy of theory that you give is in fact a contradiction with the argument that argues for a specificity of space, place, and landscape. And so I just question this theoretical approach, which in fact argues for praxis. And I mean, I would have loved to see some of these slides show the Robert Lee monument there. How about that story, using your theory in order to give us an example that is concrete, that is material?
The problem with that is, and I very much agree, I had about 60 of those examples, I cut more or less 58 of those out. Royally and the second lines in New Orleans and neutral ground statute is safe. Latour talks about situated assemblages, right? They're very, very specific to a particular time and place. While there are generalities in terms of process that I think occur in any conflicted situation, how those play out, or more specifically, how those are being played out because they're actors that are doing that, is very much a case by case thing. You know, you could certainly say, you know, I have taken more of a deductive approach in the way I presented this. I could have also taken an inductive approach and given you 20 or 30 examples and then distill this out. But what I'm trying to make is in fact the case, I'm going to put out the nutshell, that we got to figure out how to live with conflict. We got to figure out how to live with violence. We got to figure out how to live with uncertainty. We got to figure out how to live in a permanent state of crisis, because none of this is going to go away. It's actually going to get worse. It's one thing if people fight about ideas of ideologies, it becomes very different things if they start to fight about water. But your point is very well taken. Thank you.
Actually, your last point there kind of sparked my question. Could you say a little bit more how you think the impact of globalization on this notion of landscape? Everything we use every day comes from thousands of miles away. I think this idea of what we're connected to and the things in our lives is very, very different, right? Does that make sense?
In certain ways, you know, you could say place that once placed in the world is really contingent upon the relationships we form. Our place has at least become global, at least for many of us. So that is to the degree, unless we want to radically change the way we live, unavoidable. Right? We all like cheap things. Most things, right? We like to attain things, we like to attain a certain lifestyle. So we accept that more or less happily, or maybe with conscience, because we don't suffer the consequences. Somebody, someplace else suffers those consequences. Right? You know, we are all here, and I really appreciate the first conference. If I think about the carbon footprint of this endeavor here, I'll leave it at that. Really, you know, this is probably a very unsustainable endeavor, right? And we can leave this honesty enough to say that we honestly really don't care, because it's just a good thing of probably in the process. So the countervailing response is to focus on the local. Right? You know, when it's neighborhood driven, you know, whether it's a coffee shop or pub, whether it's locally sourced food, etc. So this construction of place within the immediate life or immediate sphere of influence and interaction. If we were to think that onward, then the local becomes more saving for such things. You want to think of the question how that motivated pathway is put together. So we're thinking about very literally, we'll say piles, let's think about what kind of relationships actually facilitate your interest, right? And what are some of the infiltrations from one place to the other? I took the example of Hungary, which was actually thinking the Dorset, you can actually visit that. I have sort of been starting to appreciate that, you know, I have a thing for movies and film. So Tennessee figured very prominently the Clockwork Orange I'm still trying to figure out what actually said on, because it's for how these are. This is out of place on the students. So that would be kind of, if you ask me one with a long kind of response, that's an artificial construction of a sort of Georgian, Edwardian, Victorian reality of English small town that exists, right? With all the cultural, political assumptions about it. So I think on the one side of their witnessing is the globalization that tends to marginalize a lot of things, and people resist against that globalization. So this is kind of another dimension of the self-other kind of negotiation. So I want to circle around your question, but I hope I drive it a little bit.
Can I just follow up there? It's a default to say the local, right? But what happens when the local is a politics of exclusion? Which is what we're seeing more and more. It's shrinking politics of affinity, solidarity, the kind of boundaries that you talk about. This kind of paradigm that we have with the global and the local as this, binary. We haven't been able to go beyond what that means.
And that's part of the case I'm trying to make, right? Binaries are interesting, right? They're useful to sort of draw a very cursory map, right? They're aligned, right? There's that. But it's not really all the nature of the mind. I think we have to figure out what is the nature of that. I mean, how can we actually have it or live with it? I don't think exclusionary politics work. I don't even think exclusionary strategies work. Exclusionary tactics might, for a short period of time, be very isolated pieces. But I think any time it pretends to exclude, least those necessitates, I would almost say, the counter movement, right? The transformation, the infiltration, the penetration. There's a whole lot of mechanics. And I think those are facts that are already new. I think theory on some level and very high level has fetishized that. The whole, somebody mentioned Castell's earlier, so the fetishization of flows, process, things like that. That's really ugly concept. But those are facts that happen. I think we're trying to wrap our minds around them. Similar to, what Louise was talking about earlier. I was thinking about how the Negri's work on those movements, very much about years square, and then sort of organizational horizontality, the improvisational need this. But the interesting question is, what if we take a medium of communication, right? What do we turn up the internet? Right? So the tactical response is, well, people with or talk to each other, things like that. So we don't say that these patterns of change and the version of existing order and we connected with the class. But over time, for certain periods in certain places, yes, they can do this deal, they can do this, but I don't think they can actually spread. And I don't want to think that that's really the case.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we are going to move to our coffee break right now. I'm sure a lot of you are very caffeinated or very caffeinated. I'm over caffeinated. But before we go, I want to see one more thing about the program. So after the coffee break, we'll see a session part called the talking circle. And the talking circles are framed around themes of the conference. So each of the rooms is one of the themes. And what I ask you to do is find the room that best fits your research area, go to that room, introduce yourself, say who you are, where you come from, the kind of work that you do. It's a wonderful way to get to know the other people in your thematic area. So quick copy and hit the room. Thank you, everyone. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah, I know. Oh, we also Scott has a gift for you too. Oh, somewhere there. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, thank you.
very much enjoy your talk.
I want to talk some more. It's
Well, thank you. So was yours so inspiring, and I was some familiar names of
They really worked well together. I
Yeah.
thought they would
a
be
single
from a
ever line
sort of
this up.
different
That worked
domain.
really well.